this regularly scheduled Community Development Committee meeting just quite yet. We're still waiting for a quorum, which I am sure we will have shortly. But while we're here, the council members are here, staff who's here, thanks for being here. Thanks, Tammy, for filling in. For Michelle as our recording secretary, or a recording, is that what we call them? Recording secretary, great, thanks. And so we're not gonna go through any of the business yet, committee members, but we will move into our information items while we are waiting for a quorum. And so the first information item is the Parks and Trails Legacy Fund Streetlight Research Project findings. And we will have a presentation. And I don't know that we've met. Are you? Yeah, so if you'll please introduce yourselves and thanks for being here.
Yeah, of course. Chair, committee members. My name is Raven McKnight. I think this mic is working. And this is my first time presenting to the council. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. This is actually only the second time I've presented in person since 2019. So
we all had a little bit of an interruption there, didn't we?
Yeah.
Raven came on board right at the beginning of the pandemic.
Well, welcome,
yes.
Raven.
I started as an intern at Metro Transit right before the pandemic and then switched over to community development right as the pandemic was getting started. So I've been very much working from home for the last 2 years or so.
Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm here today to share some key findings from this 2-year-long shared research project where we've been exploring some kind of novel data sources and methods for estimating park and trail visitation across the whole state. Let's see, awesome. I'll start today by giving some background about the project, and then I'm going to focus on some of our key findings about parks and trails, and I'll focus on parks and trails in the Twin Cities metro region, but we did analyze parks and trails across the whole state. I also want to share some of our key findings about visitors, so who's using the parks and trails in the metro region. And then this research effort is really wrapping up in the next couple of weeks, so I want to make sure to spend some time letting you know what you can expect to see from us in the next really 2 to 3 weeks, and then hopefully time for some Q&A at the end. So jumping right in with some project background, as you may or may not know, this has been a 2-year-long research project funded by the Minnesota Legacy Parks and Trails Fund. And this particular work was funded under the Coordinate Among Partners pillar. So a joint powers agreement was created to allow for this collaboration between the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, the Greater Minnesota Regional Parks and Trails Commission, who works with regional parks outside of the 7-county metro, and then of course the Met Council and the 10 implementing agencies we work with here in the Twin Cities. So although my position is technically with the Met Council, I've been kind of saying that I've worked for this joint powers agreement for the last 2 years or so. My time has been spent 100% on this collaborative research effort. At a really high level, the goal of this work was to determine whether or not this data source, location-based services data, would be a useful tool for park and trail research. And I'll define LBS, or location-based services data, on the next slide. But here I just wanted to highlight that this was a very exploratory research project. There are some other researchers who have used this data source for parks and trails research, but no one has really taken it on at the scale that we did. Across the 3 systems in this project, so Minnesota DNR State Parks and Trails, Greater Minnesota Regional Parks and Trails, and then Metro Parks and Trails, we evaluated about 200 parks and about 150 trails, totaling over 3,000 miles. And our goal was really to provide use estimates at the park or trail level. So rather than summarizing park visitation for the whole 7 counties or for a given implementing agency, we're really trying to provide this very detailed data. So the sheer amount of data in this project is pretty substantial. I don't want to spend too much of our time today focused on the sort of technical aspects of the data, but I do think it's important that we define LBS data. And if you've heard of this project in passing, you might have heard it referred to as the Streetlight project or the Streetlight and Parks project, which is sort of a confusing title because Streetlight Data was just our data vendor for this project. So that's really just the brand name of the location-based services data that we used. So location-based services project might be a more apt title. Location-based services, or LBS data, is derived from smartphones with opt-in GPS services. So I'm guessing that a lot of us in this room, myself included, have smartphones that we've used with different GPS applications. So obvious things like Google Maps or navigation services, but lots of different applications like social media, couponing, fitness apps. A lot of those can use GPS data to kind of customize the user experience. And of course, users always have the opportunity to opt out of those GPS services. But once you've opted in, those devices are generating a ton of spatial data just by moving around and interacting with the world. So Streetlight Data is able to gather anonymous GPS records, and then the service they really provide to us is that they do a ton of processing on their end to further aggregate and anonymize that data to produce this really nice data set that we can use for this kind of analysis. A couple things I think are really important to highlight about this data source are the phrase aggregated and anonymized. This data is very heavily aggregated, and it's anonymized at multiple steps along the way. So data privacy is really inherently baked into this data product, and it could never be used to identify individuals in any way, but it can be used to look at broader patterns of travel. We actually got this data through a partnership with MnDOT, so they use this data for sort of transportation and traffic analysis, and we're just kind of stretching its application to apply to parks and trails in this work. A couple benefits of LBS data for park and trail research are that because it's being generated kind of passively whenever devices are moving around in the world, we don't have to do any in-field work, meaning we don't have to have somebody physically in a park or on a trail to gather LBS data for that location. And similarly, because the data is being generated passively, we can get a lot of spatial and temporal detail in our results. So here I'll just highlight a little bit of what we actually can measure with the LBS data in this project. And one thing that I think is important to note in the metro region in particular is that the definitions we're working with in this project don't 100% line up with the definitions that we use in things like our annual use estimates or the visitor studies. Just because these data sources are so very different in how they're generated, there's some inherent discrepancies in how things are measured. So if you see any numbers on the figures today that don't quite line up with your expectations, that's just because we have some slight definitional differences. That said, the LBS data in this project allows us to estimate weekly visits to parks, and that's individual parks, including bikes, pedestrians, and people arriving in vehicles. And then we're also estimating monthly miles of use on trails. Streetlight also provides some inferred visitor home locations and demographics, which we'll spend some more time talking about later today. But whenever I mention that data, I think it's important to call out right off the bat that this data can complement, but absolutely not replace the kind of qualitative data we can get from surveys or focus groups where we can talk to people face to face. Overall, we're reporting use estimates for January of 2019 through April of 2022, and again, at about 200 parks and 150 trails, so a pretty significant amount of data. With that, I'll jump into some of our key findings, and I'm going to focus, like I mentioned, on just the Twin Cities parks and trails. But something to keep in mind is that we have all of these same summaries for the state parks and trails and regional trails in the rest of the state. So our first big finding from this work, which I hope you can all agree with, is that parks and trails provide a ton of value to the region and to the state at large. This figure is kind of the highest level summary that we can produce from this work. This is our annual use estimate for both parks and trails. So on the left in the blue bars, these are our estimated use estimates for parks in the metro region. So we have 3 bars, one for each year, 2019, 20, and 2021. And then on the right, the green bars are our estimated trail use estimates. Altogether, this comes out to an average of 34 park visits and 57 miles of trail use per resident of the 7-county metro area. And of course, we know that those visits aren't actually going to be equally distributed across the population like that, but I think that those numbers are really impressive and start to show us really how much value these parks and trails are giving to residents of Minnesota and to the metro region. One thing you might notice right away looking at these figures is that there was a pretty significant increase in visitation in 2020, largely due to the COVID-19 pandemic at parks, but especially at trails. But overall, 2021 visitation was still higher than 2019 visitation, so visitation is trending up at both parks and trails based on our estimates, which I think is great news. Like I mentioned, this is kind of the highest level summary we can possibly get from this data. We can slice this in a lot of different ways to look at a specific week or month, a specific park or trail. But in the interest of time today, I'm not going to do so much of that kind of slicing and dicing. And instead, I'll just try to highlight some of what I think are the really high-level, interesting pieces about parks and trails. So a few specific things about parks. One of our first findings from this work was that COVID-19 affected individual parks really, really differently. This project really kicked off in June of 2021, and at that time, I think a lot of us were expecting to see this kind of across-the-board huge jump in visitation in spring and summer of 2020, because as we all know, people's behavior was changing really rapidly in that time. And we certainly did see that happen at some parks where there was just a super anomalous high visitation year in 2020. But there are also a lot of kind of counterexamples. So this picture is from inside the Como Conservatory, and you might remember the conservatory and zoo closed completely in, I think, April of 2020 when the stay-at-home orders began, and when it reopened, it was on a pretty limited reservation basis for quite a few months. So this is a pretty extreme example of a park that lost almost all of its visitation at the beginning of the pandemic, And there we saw lots of other parks that had various amenity closures that kind of gave it the opposite reaction to COVID that we expected. So this specific example is about COVID, but I think the finding is a little bit broader. And the finding is just that there's so much variation from park to park and trail to trail that kind of system level summaries are necessarily kind of losing some details. So we think that when it's possible, this kind of park level or trail level data is really, really valuable. A few other findings about parks. We found that most visitors arrive to parks sort of right around noon or shortly after work, and that's sort of 5 to 7 p.m. timeframe, which was really specific to regional parks here and across the state. State parks generally have their peak in visitation right around noon, but regional parks everywhere had that second peak after work, which I think matches our intuition about how people might use regional versus state parks a little bit differently. And then in the metro area, we found that about 58% of visitors arrive by vehicle. The rest are about 35% on foot and 7% on bikes, which was also fairly specific to the metro. State parks and regional parks in other parts of the state tend to have much closer to 60, 70, 80% of visitors arriving in vehicles.
Oh, yeah. Councilmember Bento.
Yeah, quick question, Raven. So the 58% is for the metro area?
Yes, correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Yep, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so thinking about trails, these are some also very high-level findings. But something you might have noticed on that first slide was that trails had a much larger sort of COVID effect than parks. And that's for a few reasons, but mainly to do with social distancing. There weren't really many trails that had to close amenities to support social distancing. And in fact, we have a lot of sort of counterexamples where places like the Minneapolis chain of lakes opened up those adjacent roads, like the Minneapolis parkways, to allow for more people to use the trails safely. So we just didn't have kind of that those closures happening on trails. Also for the metro region, we found that about 60% of trail use was by bicyclists. So the majority of use was by bikes. It's not a huge majority. And we did find that pedestrians make up a larger share during winter and in very walkable areas. Walkable areas is pretty self-explanatory. These are places like neighborhoods and downtowns where people are naturally just walking around a lot. And then in winter months, we think that's happening in part because not all trails are maintained for easy bike use throughout the winter, but also we're just dropping off a lot of sort of recreational bike trips. There's a lot of bicyclists who love to bike in the summer and not so much in the winter, so we're just not seeing as much recreational bike use in those very cold months. We also saw that a lot of trails were very busy shortly before 9 a.m. and again shortly after 5 p.m., which we think is really interesting because it suggests that those specific trails might be being used for transportation purposes, kind of mirroring the typical 9 to 5 commute. So we know that trails are really important to recreation, but in those cases, we also have some pretty strong evidence that they're important to the transportation network as well. And that was also, we see that in different places across the state, but I would say that that pattern was most common in the metro region. So there's a lot of other things that we could say about parks and trails. Like I mentioned, we can drill way down and look at this data for an individual park or trail. But for today's conversation, I want to switch over to think a little bit more about visitors. So who's actually using these parks and trails? And Streetlight data gives us a couple different ways to think about this question. The first thing we can look at is where visitors to parks and trails live. So Streetlight data estimates where visitors live based on that anonymous GPS data we talked about earlier. And in this map here on the left, we aggregated that to the county level. So this is a map of Minnesota by county. The darker the county, the more visitors to the metro region live in that county. So naturally, the darkest counties are the 7 counties in the immediate adjacent areas. But during the summer of 2021, we detected visitation from every single Minnesota county. And in fact, we found that about 21% of visitors live in a different county than the park they're visiting. So starting to see that kind of regional rather than just local draw for regional parks.
Ms. McKnight, can I ask, please, at this on the slide, with the 21% of visitors coming from different counties, does that mean counties outside the 7-county metro area, or does that mean visitors within the 7 counties as well, but just crossing a county line to visit a park?
Sure, thank you for the question. It's the latter. So, visitors to Hennepin County coming from Ramsey County would be counted in that 21%.
Okay, cool.
I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it's something like 10% maybe are from outside of the 7 counties. So
That's cool. And I think just since we paused for a sec, welcome Councilmember Chambliss. You're a quorum maker, so I'm just going to call this meeting to order. Cool.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, please, Ms. McKnight.
So Yeah, we're
Oh,
seeing.
I'm sorry, Jenna, but Councilmember Chambliss, just so you were, we went into the information items since we didn't have a quorum, so we're on the first information item, the Parks and Legacy Research Project.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, sorry, Ms. McKnight.
No
please.
problem. So yeah, we're seeing some non-local visitation from within the state, but during the summer of 2021, we also saw about 7.5% of visitors coming from outside of Minnesota. Wisconsin and the other adjacent states were the most common non-Minnesota home location, but there was also a significant share of visitation coming from California, Texas, Florida, and all 48 of the lower United States were represented, which I think is really impressive when we consider the fact that this is data for summer of 2021, when people were still traveling significantly less than usual, I would say. Like the other data we've looked at so far today, this is, I think, pretty interesting to summarize at the metropolitan system level, but we can also zoom in to look at this data for a specific park or trail. So I'll give us one example of what this data looks like for just one park. Here we're looking at a map of estimated or inferred visitor home locations for Theodore Wirth Regional Park at the zip code level. So on the left is the map of the whole state, and on the right, I've just zoomed into the metropolitan region. So hopefully you can see the sort of light gray outline of the 7 counties. And the yellow dot indicates Theodore Wirth's location in North Minneapolis. If we look at this map, we see that visitation is pretty tightly concentrated around Theodore Wirth in Minneapolis, but the whole 7-county metro area is pretty well represented, and we even see some zip codes outside of the metro area popping up as common home locations for these park visitors. So we think this data is pretty interesting. It can help us sort of get a sense of how local versus regional the audience for a given park is. But we can also take this a step further and use this information to start learning a little bit about the demographics of park visitors. And that's what we're kind of going to talk about for the rest of this presentation. One of our findings, which is also sort of a call to action and an area for future work, is just about the fact that this really detailed data about visitor home locations and visitor demographics allows us to do some kind of interesting equity analysis that we might not otherwise be able to do with other park research data sets. So for each park and trail in the project sample, Streetlight is providing us with some inferred visitor demographics based on 2020 census data. So Streetlight combines those inferred home locations we were just looking at with data from the census, and they do some statistical modeling on their end to estimate visitor demographics. There are a few key limitations about this data source to note. First, it is inferred data, so we would naturally have more confidence in data gathered from surveys or focus groups where we can talk to people face-to-face and learn about their identities and lived experiences. But that kind of really detailed survey data is rarely available at the park or trail level, so we think that this inferred data can help us kind of fill in those gaps when that data doesn't exist. Similarly, we are limited to the categories that the census defines. So this table on the left shows the categories of data that we have. We have data for race and ethnicity, household income, and highest level of educational attainment. And we know that especially for race and ethnicity, these census categories can be pretty limiting. In an ideal world, we might be able to disaggregate this data a little bit differently, but as I'm sure you all know, we're often limited to these census definitions. Even with those kind of limitations in mind, we think that this data can be really helpful when we consider it at the park or trail level. We think it can be helpful for identifying barriers to access at specific parks, and in that way it can be helpful for guiding survey efforts or outreach efforts. But as I mentioned, it's really best used at the park or trail level. So I'll walk us through 2 examples of this data at a specific park. And specifically, I'll try to kind of ask the question, is visitation to this park equitable? So the first example we'll look at is for Theodore Wirth Regional Park, since we were just looking at those home location maps. There's a lot going on this slide, so I'll walk us through the figure in just a moment. But the question here is, are visitors to Theodore Wirth representative of the region's population? There's lots of different ways we might define equitable visitation, but this is just one sort of baseline we might use. So this figure on the left is trying to kind of address that question. Along the y-axis, we have those census race and ethnicity categories, and the x-axis, we have percentages. And we're looking at 4 different populations on this figure. So the gray bars indicate the population of the 7-county metropolitan region. The blue bars are the population of Hennepin County. Green bars represent Minneapolis, and then the orange points are our estimates for visitors to Theodore Wirth Regional Park. I think the story is easiest to sort of understand if we zoom into just one category, so I'll focus on the third group of bars there for the Black population, and I pulled out this table on the bottom right of the slide just to highlight some of those specific values. So we see, based on the 2020 census, that about 10% of the 7-county metro area was Black, about 13% of Hennepin County was Black, and about 19% of Minneapolis was Black. We can compare that to our estimates for visitors to Theodore Wirth, where we're estimating about 12.5% of those visitors are Black. This is where I think it becomes pretty obvious that we need to consider this data at the park level, and we really need a lot of expert knowledge and context about a park. Because if we compare those 12.5% Black visitors to the 7-county metro or to Hennepin County, it looks like, yeah, visitors to Theodore Wirth are relatively representative of the population. We have 12.5% Black visitors in a 13% Black county. That looks fairly representative. But if we think about that map of visitors to Theodore Wirth, we saw that visitors were really heavily concentrated right around the park in Minneapolis. And if we compare the park visitors to the population of Minneapolis, we start to see this kind of gap. If we have 12% Black visitors in a 19% Black area, that might indicate that there are some sort of barriers to access for Black visitors to Theodore Wirth. And if you're familiar with this park specifically, you might know that those neighborhoods sort of directly north of the park are significantly more than 19% Black, and visitation is really highly concentrated in those areas, and there's not really any formal entrances into the park from the north side. So this is where we really need somebody who's deeply familiar with the park and can think about who the target audience for a park is in order to really do this kind of analysis justice, because we're telling a really different story depending on who we compare visitors to. I think the importance of choosing a kind of comparison population is really clear if you think about a state versus regional park, where it's kind of right in the name. We expect a state park to be drawing visitors from across Minnesota, whereas a regional park should be drawing visitors from some less clearly defined region. We can look at maybe a slightly simpler example. This is data for Carver Park Reserve, which, if you're not familiar, is a really beautiful park reserve about 30 minutes outside of Minneapolis in Carver County, as the name suggests. And this figure is laid out the same way, where the metro region is represented by the gray bars, blue bars are Carver County, and then the points are our estimates for the population of visitors to the park reserve. Here we see that about 70% of the region, or 69% of the region, is white, according to the 2020 census. Carver County was about 85% white, and then we're estimating about 81% white visitors to this park. This is a pretty solidly suburban park, maybe half an hour outside of Minneapolis, so we probably do expect a significant portion of visitors to come from within Carver County, but it is a regional park, not a local park, so we also expect some amount of visitors to be coming from the rest of the 7 counties and probably from counties outside of those 7 counties. So realistically, the right comparison population is probably not going to fall into an easy category of Carver County or a city limit or the 7-county metro. We probably do expect to see somewhere between 69 and 85% white visitors, and we really need someone with a lot of information about Carver Park Reserve to make the most informed decisions about this analysis. So in a lot of ways, we feel like the best next steps for this work are for us to kind of hand this data off to the people who do work in specific parks and trails and do have these really specific research questions. There was just no way for me to learn this much sort of historical context and detail about all 350 parks and trails in our sample. So this is where we're very proud to have created this data source, and we're excited to see what other practitioners sort of do with it now. So I know this was a super high-level summary of a lot of different data sources, and especially here I've just introduced kind of a lot more questions than answers. But I have just one more summary slide about this sort of wrapping up this project, and then I can take questions. So as I mentioned, this has been a 2-year-long research project, which is wrapping up really in the next 2 or 3 weeks, which is a little bit surreal to say out loud. But the final research product from this work is going to be this project website, which I've included a screenshot of the draft version here. This will include all of our written findings about parks, trails, and visitors. The content is going through some peer review right now, but there will also be a bunch of additional resources like frequently asked questions, the code we use to do this analysis, all of our technical documentation, all of that good stuff. You'll also be able to download the really detailed data I've been referencing today in the form of an Excel workbook and shapefiles. There will be some nice interactive components, and then we're also providing some kind of summarized and interpreted figures for each park and trail. So I know this is way too small to actually read on this slide, but I just wanted to flash this up as an example. This is a fact sheet for Battle Creek Regional Park in Ramsey County, and we'll be providing these one-page summaries for each park and trail, which provide some high-level and some more detailed takeaways about each park and trail to hopefully start to answer some of these unit-level questions. And then the last thing I wanted to highlight is that next week, starting a week from today actually, we're putting on sort of a grand finale webinar series. So Monday through Thursday, I'll be presenting 4 webinars. Monday will be a key findings presentation, which will sort of be an extended version of what you saw here today, focused on the whole state, not just the metro region. And then Tuesday through Thursday, we'll focus on parks, trails, and visitors, respectively. This link, which is in these slides, which I hope will be posted after this meeting, will take you to the registration links for all 4 webinars. They'll be totally public and recorded, posted on the website after the fact. And even if you can't make it to the live events, if you sign up for any of the webinars, you'll be added to our mailing list to get all of these resources after the fact. So that would be a good way to just make sure you're on the list to receive all of these more detailed pieces in the next couple of weeks. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Raven, for the presentation and for the work. This is really fascinating, and I get it. We're just seeing very high level. And so it'll be interesting to see how we use this data going forward. Discussion or questions? Councilmember Bento.
First of all, Raven, thank you. I love this stuff. What time of the day will the webinars be at?
Sure. They'll be at 9:30 to 11 a.m.
Okay.
I think they'll probably be closer to 1 hour in length, but we've scheduled 90 minutes just in case.
Thanks. So Emmett has heard me kind of pontificate about this question before, and I'm curious as to whether there's any research or collaboration going on between the state and national parks and city and county parks. I live in an area of Maplewood, very, very south end. Friends refer to it as Woodbury or St. Paul, and some of us who live in this area call it St. Mapleberry because it just makes sense. But we have a lot of city parks in Maplewood. We have a number of trails, and Woodbury has a lot of city parks and trails. And I've often wondered if there wouldn't be some benefit to look at all of this, both in terms of the data, you know, it would be interesting to compare the data and find out what the usage is in those parks as well, and also coordination in terms of programming and planning. I know I represent the council. I'm ex officio from the council to the MPOSC, and I know there's a lot of work being done on planning and programming and being more diverse and culturally inclusive, but I feel like we're missing an opportunity to link with those city and county entities to find out what they're doing and to make sure that we're not stepping on each other and competing with each other with very limited resources on everybody's part. So I don't expect you to answer that here today, but I'm interested going forward as to how we can get that kind of collaboration going on and if there's any value in it.
Ms. McKnight, did you care to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, Chair Committee Member, thank you for the comment or question. You know, in this project, we were focused on the state and regional parks, but the methods we developed could theoretically be applied to pretty much any park or sort of geographic region you defined. So if somebody else had interest in kind of conducting this analysis for a set of local or city or national parks, you know, there might be some tweaks to the methods you need to make, but theoretically these same methods should apply to pretty much any park or trail. So there might be some opportunity for that kind of collaboration with this sort of data.
Well, and just for the record, I want to note that during COVID, so many friends of mine and family members of mine commented on just how much they appreciated the regional park system and the trails. For some, it was a middle of the day break from working at home, and for others it was FIED for their kids. I mean, they were invaluable, and they really, really were a resource that we can all be grateful for and proud of.
Great, thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to wholeheartedly endorse what Councilmember Vento said. That's been a concern of mine for many years when we talk about park usage, because you know, if you've got kids in school and they're in, you know, baseball or soccer or all of these other things, your whole life becomes going to city ball fields or city soccer fields, and you don't necessarily have time to do the trips to the regional park or Like for me, I bike a lot, but the regional parks are a little farther away and the regional trails are a little farther away. So I might go on a 20-mile bike ride on city and county trails the entire way. That doesn't mean that I don't value the regional trails or that I am not getting my park use in, but I think it's important to look at the whole system holistically. I think this is a great first step, and I look forward to seeing more detailed information. I wish the presentation had been on the internet before we started because those things were little tiny, but I'm hoping that we're going to get links to digging into more information because I think it's going to be fascinating to look and see what is there. And are there going to be other ways to see this information besides webinars? I hate sitting watching video.
Chair, committee member, yeah, we will have, they'll be recorded, but also everything will be in this project website. So our goal with the project website was really to condense our technical report, which is, over 100 pages into, less than 10,000 words. So it's not a short document because it is a lot of work, but each report about parks, trails, visitors is pretty short and digestible and has kind of the sorts of figures we were looking at today with like annual use estimates and system level summaries. So yeah, there will be some static and interactive digital reports that should get at everything that we're presenting in the webinars.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. And I know Councilmember Lee is in queue to speak, but just before we move on, before I recognize you, I want to lift up the comments of Councilmembers Vento and Wolf about that interplay between regional facilities and local facilities. And it seems like it's a consistent issue across the metro, which is how often you find that. And in the city of Minneapolis, of course, there's the local parks and then the regional parks, and it actually creates a different sort of resource pipeline to investment in those parks that doesn't, I don't think, or we don't really have the data, but may not reflect the intensity of use between those different parks. So even before you mentioned that, Councilmember Wolf, and when Councilmember Bento was talking, I was already kind of thinking about ways we can incentivize creating more data from local parks with some of the resources that we now have. So cool. Thanks. More discussion, Councilmember Lee.
Yep. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your work, Raven. I also, once again, want to thank the staff for hiring interns that later get promoted to be full-time staff to work with us. This is a great presentation, but I was just concerned that if we're only using technology that captures smartphone information, then we're missing out on capturing folks who don't have smartphones. Or for example, if a poor family of 5 goes in there and only one of the adults has a smartphone, then we're not counting the 4 others that are going with them. And so if we continue to do in-person or focus groups or however we used to do them in person, that would still be a great way to capture as many people as we can too.
Chair, committee member, if I may respond, I have 2 points. First is, we're not recommending that this data source replace traditional methods in any way. We definitely think that this data source is best used in combination with our traditional surveys and things like that. But we didn't really get into the methods of this project much today, but one thing that Streetlight data does on the back end that's very valuable to us is they do a ton of very complicated analysis and data cleaning to correct for the fact that their data sample doesn't include every single smartphone and the fact that the entire population doesn't own smartphones. So they do a lot of sort of statistical corrections on their end so that their data is more representative of the population than just the sample of smartphones that they are sampling data from. So we know there is some potential for bias based on the fact that not every person owns a smartphone, but smartphone adoption has been pretty universal across different socioeconomic groups at this point, and Streetlight is doing a lot of work to correct for that potential bias wherever possible. So it is something to keep in mind, but we think it's not, it probably is not changing our overall takeaways very much at this high level of analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Cool, thank you. Thanks. Any further questions, further discussion on this report? Seeing none, Ms. McKnight, thanks for the work, thanks for the report. I'm looking forward to seeing how this data continues to sort of infiltrate our work here. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And committee members, I did call the meeting to order, so we'll return to the top of the agenda. And we have an agenda before us. We've done a little bit of rearranging, but if there's no other changes or comments, I will assume we have an approved agenda. Any changes? Okay, looks good. The next item is approval of the Community Development Committee minutes for May 1st, 2023. Is there a motion?
Move approval?
Thanks. Is there a second?
Second.
Sure, thanks. Any discussion, additions, corrections? Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, that carries. We have a consent agenda that includes 2 items, the Big Marine Park Reserve Long Range Plan and the City of North Oaks Comprehensive Plan Amendment. And is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Move approval?
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks. And all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The consent agenda passes, and we're on to our non-consent business item. It's item 2023-102, a joint committees item. It's a 2023 budget amendment, second quarter. And Heather is here to present to us. Heather Giesel, welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. My name is Heather Giesel. I am the Finance Director for Community Development. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and you can call me Heather. So budget amendments are a routine part of our budgeting process annually, and we come to you approximately quarterly to make adjustments to our operating and capital budgets. Tonight, we're requesting to amend the Community Development's capital program. The amendment is pretty straightforward and is primarily an accounting cleanup item this time since we don't have any new funds to authorize. So first, in the administrative amendment section, project details for these adjustments can be found in attachment 3 and represent projects where funding has already been approved and is now being moved into a specific or programmed into a specific project. So as a quick reminder, there's no formal action for you to take on these administrative adjustments. They're here just for transparency and for accounting purposes. You'll note the acquisition projects have been approved by the council through separate official actions at the recommendation of the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, and other projects you see in this section have been reviewed for conformity with the Regional Parks Policy Plan. In the closing project section, we are removing nearly $34 million in completed projects from the park's authorized capital program. All the projects have been fully expended. And then finally, in the first section of the amendment, where we reduce authorizations, and if there had been new projects or funds to bring in, you'd see them in that section as well. You'll see that there are some expiring state fiscal year 2018 ENRTF funds. These funds had an original expiration date of June 30th, 2020. We did get a 1-year extension to that date if a binding contract for acquisition for real property had been entered into before the expiration date. Unfortunately, we did not have any eligible projects come in to use that funding, so there's about $64,000 of the appropriation that is going unencumbered due to the lack of eligible projects. So this amendment supports the Thrive outcome of stewardship by assessing future needs, responsible planning, and management of financial resources for the Community Development Capital Program. Our proposed action is that you authorize the 2023 Unified Budget Amendment as indicated and in accordance with the attached tables. And thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Heather, for the
I'll stand for any
report.
questions.
Questions on that report? Any discussion? Seems pretty straightforward and more like housekeeping, so it's an easy one. Seeing no discussion, the proposed action is that the Metropolitan Council authorize the 2023 Unified Budget Amendment as indicated in accordance with the attached tables. Is there a motion to approve?
Second.
All right, thank you. The motion is before us. Any discussion? Discussion. Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you. We will move, yes.
I do have one comment. We don't have any of our new people here,
Right.
which is unfortunate. But the next time we have one of these, we may want to have a quick primer for them about how there's some funds that are, you get a piece of the pie. So if you don't spend it, it goes back in your piece of the pie for a new project or another project. And there's some that are competitive or first come, first serve, like the acquisition funds, where if you don't need it all for your acquisition, it goes back into the pot that's available to everybody,
I think
just so
that,
that they know the difference between the.
thanks, Councilman Wolf. I think that's a great idea. And so I'm sure Heather hears that, and he's coming for us about quarterly, so we'll have that opportunity. And there's so much information in here, it's so dynamic, as you're pointing out. And so you can really learn a lot by being familiar with this report. So we'll do that.
And Mr.
Yeah,
Chair, if I
please,
may,
Director Barajas.
we'll also include that as part of our annual budget conversation too, since that's when we're really working on those numbers more deeply, just to kind of reinforce that. It's a great idea.
Great suggestion. Thank you. Thank you.
And Chair, committee members, I'll just note too that those conversations will happen sooner than the next budget amendment. Otherwise, we'd be waiting until August, September. So the budget conversations will happen more quickly, so we can get that information to the new council
Thank you.
members.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. And then we'll move on to our final agenda item for the day. It's an information item as well. It's the Housing Policy Planning Overview. And is that Sarah? Oh, no, it's Hilary. Correct? Yep, so Ms. Lovelace, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, committee members. My name is Hilary Lovelace, she, her, hers. I'm a housing planning analyst here at the council. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the 2050 Regional Development Guide as kind of an overview of our council endorsed vision and values. And then we'll move forward into kind of the meat of our presentation about the housing policy plan update. And then last, I have some questions for y'all on what you'd like to talk about in depth in the future, what you'd like to learn more about, if anything was missing from my slides. So the Regional Vision and Values and Goals has this neat summary image, which looks at our vision and values feeding into goals and objectives about how we do our work and how we measure our work in the future. And then at the bottom has information about each of our policy areas that we're talking about. So the housing policy ribbon kind of hanging down from the goals and objectives, you'll notice, doesn't have two parts like parks or transportation or water services. We are just a policy area. We are not a system. The other part that's kind of different about housing that isn't reflected in this picture that I just want to call attention to is that instead of planning all the way out until 2050, for many of our housing programs, we only plan out 10 decades. Or 1 decade, 10 years. Only 10 decades. I'm an extra long-range planner. We only look out 10 years because as part of our policies, we're asking a lot of communities to do work on, and we don't want to ask them to do work into the future that we might have better data on later. The other really exciting, I'm going to go back real quick. The other really exciting thing about this is the cross-cutting goals, which is working with other policy areas at the council in order to focus on our common goals. And so because I'm a little bit of a selfish person, I'm always thinking about how other policy areas can help housing meet their needs. And I welcome you to do the same as we're kind of talking throughout this presentation. There is a shortened form of regional core values. If you were around or have read a lot of the 2040 Regional Development Guide, these may seem a little bit familiar from Thrive. We have equity, leadership, accountability, and stewardship. What I really like about these is that it's so obvious to see these in every policy area that we have across the council. The regional vision, which was adopted by the council a month and a half ago, 2 months ago at this point, includes 4 different kind of visions for the council. The first 2 of equitable, inclusive, and welcoming, and communities that are healthy, safe, and vibrant, I see as most applicable to the powers that we have as the council. Leading on addressing climate change and restoring and protecting natural systems are also important, but aren't really within direct control that we have on housing policy. They're more related to our land use work around housing. Now that we've kind of gone over those things, it's just a little bit of a refresher. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the housing policy plan and the context of which we write it in. Many of you might be familiar that the housing policy plan was first written in the early 70s, and then again in 1985, and not again until about 10 years ago in 2014. That large gap of time in between, I think, kind of shows that priorities often change within our region, and that the focus on housing policy is something that we've kind of had to uplift and hold. I feel like we're in a pretty unique political moment where there's a lot of focus on housing. As I was watching interviews of council members for the Metropolitan Council, almost everyone mentioned housing at some point during their interview. And so unlike in other decades, we don't really need to prove the worth of this work. We can spend a lot of time doing it right and focusing on doing the work. The housing policy plan covers a number of different things included on this slide, including preparing the region for possible scenarios, defining local government shares of regional affordable housing need for low and moderate income housing, reviewing local comprehensive plans and making sure that each community has a supply of adequate land that can support the development of affordable housing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later. Also funding community development through the local communities, Livable Communities Act programs. We offer some rental assistance through our HRA to low-income households in the form of housing choice vouchers, and providing support to local governments with technical assistance and data. I didn't order these purposefully, kind of in order of like where we have the most influence to where we kind of have like less influence in it. But that I think is a little bit true on this slide. This slide is maybe more for folks who are new to the council, and again, kind of like Councilmember Wolf said earlier, it's a little unfortunate we don't have any of the new folks today, but I kind of wanted to do a quick rundown on government roles in housing and how each level of government has a different amount of power and focus on their funds and policy. The main point I'm trying to make with this slide is that the Metropolitan Council has unique levers of policy and authorities and funding that other areas don't. But more than that, we are one of the areas that works the most in partnership between all of these levels. Because we're smack dab there in the middle, we're doing a lot that touches the work that that counties and cities do within our region, but also translating some of the information from our federal and state government on housing policy. I also wanted to just kind of note that there is clear statutory language that guides our work in regional housing policy, specifically stating that each community plan needs to include enough land that promotes the availability of the development of low and moderate income housing. This is something that is part of the reason why I chose to work here. I think it's a really bold goal to make sure that at the regional level, we focus on making sure that anyone, regardless of their income or means, has the ability to live somewhere in the region that they find attractive and want to call home. So in the housing policy plan work, I borrowed this. You may, if you were at the presentation that Emmett gave a couple of weeks ago, this might look a little familiar. I borrowed the timeline from the Regional Parks Policy Plan in a large way. On our work. Right now we're wrapping up our initiation stage. We've done a lot of staffing. We have a new housing planner on the team. I think today or sometime this week she hits a month at the council. We've focused a lot on creating an engagement plan with our community engagement staff here at the council and talking to some folks external. We'll be kicking off engagement bright and early tomorrow morning in Burnsville with an English language learners class at School District 191. And that's just the first of our kind of community exchange sessions that we hope to hold throughout the summer and into the early fall. We also plan on creating a focus group, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Late this year, we'll move more into the execution stage of starting to make some decisions about what will go into the housing policy plan and wrap up a 75% draft by the end of Q2 of next year, hopefully a little bit earlier than that. So we have a lot of time to get feedback and make tweaks. And then in line with the adoption of the whole regional development guide, by the end of next year, we'll finish the housing policy plan. We'll continue coordination with the whole regional development guide process throughout that. And as part of that, if you go to Committee of the Whole later this week, I think on Wednesday, you'll hear a little bit from the youth cohort outreach, which has already started to shape some of the work that we're doing on the housing policy plan. Not to spoil the lead, but there was a lot of feedback on the importance of a feeling of place and stability from youth, and that has led us to put a little bit more focus and time on anti-displacement policy. So although we're conducting our own engagement for the housing policy plan, we're also listening to all other engagement pieces that are happening around this. To dive in a little bit more to our approach on engagement, we're starting with these community exchange sessions where we come with information about the council, what power we have, how to contact folks if you have questions or immediate needs about housing, and a fun and playful opportunity to think about the future of what you want home to look and feel like within the region. And we're kind of asking for thoughts and opinions of people who work with us. So I mentioned that tomorrow morning we're working with English language learners, adults. We've also reached out to many different groups across the region, affordable housing developments that have community councils. We are meeting to talk more in detail with a group in Fridley, and I don't want to get the name of it wrong, but it's something like the Islamic Education Center. We've talked to a few different Native groups within the Twin Cities at this point. Also talking to a lot of early childhood family education classes to make sure that we're speaking to folks who've historically not been represented in community engagement practices. We're also paying folks for their time when they're present in those meetings, and sometimes that comes in the form of paying the organization that they're part of. Other times it comes in the form of direct gift cards to participants. If someone wants to be part of a housing policy plan working group where we focus more in like 5 to 6 in-depth hour, 2-hour, 3-hour long sessions on specific housing policy plan areas, they need to attend one of these community engagement sessions, either as kind of a note taker or a group facilitator. The reason I kind of wanted to create that requirement isn't to add one more thing to busy people's calendars, but to make sure that when they're coming to be part of a focus group session, they're coming fresh with information from community members, that they've been steeped more in the experience of folks who haven't been in political or planning circles for a really long time, or development circles.
Hilary, to that point, could I ask, please,
Yeah.
this seems really robust, and I don't think I was here during the last development. I wasn't here of the housing policy plan. And so is this new? Is this innovative? Is this building on what we've done in the past? So I do community engagement in my day job, and this just looks like a really robust plan.
Yeah, I also wasn't here for the last housing policy plan chairload, but I know that we did have a housing policy plan working group, and I read a lot of the notes from those meetings. And one thing that I feel like is missing from our current housing policy plan is the stories of people. There's a lot of good data in our existing housing policy plan, and it's compelling, and it drove me to action. But it doesn't tell the stories of actual people in our region. And so I wanted to make sure that there's an opportunity for folks who normally don't have power to speak to power in this process. Is there anything else, Lisa?
Director Brazo?
She got it.
Great, thanks. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Besides the more in the weeds housing policy plan kind of detailed working group, we're also posting some online issue surveys where we're focused more on a specific piece of housing policy. The first example of this will probably be posted later this week. on income limits. When I spoke to the Community Development Committee in October, just a couple of months ago, you guys gave me support to think about how we consider affordability limits as we were writing policy. So we've done some work on that, and we're planning to unveil some data and thoughts and questions to the community, both of developers and planners and housing practitioners, but also people who live in the region, and asking them what their stories are about affordability limits and what that looks like. HUD released the income limits for 2023 just an hour and a half ago. So we are rolling out our new official numbers alongside an opportunity to think about what the future of that should look like as we're crafting policy. But we'll also put out some online issue surveys on hot topics kind of as they arrive in our community exchange sessions, so that we're not leaving the hot conversation in one room, that we're kind of allowing people to continue it and reach a broader audience. Any more questions on this one before I move on? I know this is kind of
Councilmember
exciting.
Wolf and then Councilmember Chambliss. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I understand reaching out to new people, but how do we make sure we get the stories of what's been tried and why it does or doesn't work from people who have been doing this work as well?
Hilary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Wolf. One of the things that our friends in the land use work are doing is leading a regional advisory planning group. And so I've already spoken with them once and plan to speak with them again. So this is city staff who are, and the meetings are collaborated by Metro Cities and council staff, kind of responding to comprehensive plan update writing process from last time. So we've already begun discussions with kind of our usual crowd of suspects. And they're very involved and interested and engaged in telling us what didn't work as well last time and what they want to change for next time. And not, area that we're talking about.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Chambliss.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate the framework of the different roles and the authority for this whole process and how the different policymakers are connected. It would be nice to see how we can strengthen those policymaker connections and how we are engaging to work together to meet the needs for housing from a collaborative standpoint. And it's also very interesting, the wording in terms of authority and how on page 5 through 7, we're talking about our statutory authority, providing direction on our housing approach and the use. But there are impacts to our authority if we do not have the funding to adequately address housing needs. So that's something I think we should dig into a little bit further, because we can have the authority to provide the direction and the authority to quote unquote enforce the policies. But even if we were able to do that and we don't have the funds, that's when we start running into some problems. And talking about the people aspect and the stories, we cannot get away from that. I think the stories are present if we take a look. If we look at homelessness, I work downtown and I see many more youth homeless walking around with large bags. I did not see that as much before. So looking at how are the housing needs changing and how can we support the youth who are our future to make sure that they are whole and have a place to live. It's very, difficult to see them. And I reflect and I think, what are the conditions that have created this circumstance? We know that, there are things that happen in society or decisions that are made when we're young that have some serious consequences. But as the people who have the authority to make housing opportunities for our young people, for our elderly people, I think that's something that we should try to get ahead of, because if we don't, then if we don't develop policies that address the needs of our youth, that problem can get even larger, and it's even more difficult to do without all the adequate funding.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Chambers, for raising that, especially the youth component in there. Like, so I sort of live more on the community exchange session side of this graphic, and just this last week, I was probably in 3 intense conversations about exactly what you're bringing up, because that sector of housing and then the direct service that, or the support that those individuals need, just doesn't even exist right now within our system. And so there's an opportunity to at least see that it exists in the policies and plans as they go forward. And just to the top bullet under the community exchange, engaging people with lived experience is challenging, and it takes intention, right? And so I look forward to seeing how that plays out. And something, yeah, Councilmember Vento.
I have a quick question. Hilary, with the community leaders and organizers that you talked about during the community exchange sessions, how much of that is beyond the core cities and suburbs? How much of that extends into the outer ring of Anoka and Washington and Carver and Scott, and et cetera?
Chair, Councilmember Vento, I really appreciate the question. We've been working hard to reach out to school districts and CAPS through county agencies to see if we can find some folks outside of kind of our more urbanized core. Many of the groups that we're talking to that are in suburban areas have kind of a broader reach. They don't just serve their immediate community in the suburbs. They're kind of like the hub for services for the suburbs and further out. I don't want to count on that as the only reach that we have into more rural areas. And so part of what we're doing, kind of related to Councilmember Wolf's question earlier, is in our normal work, we're already reaching out to kind of city planners across the region. So as part of that, we're working with sector reps on visiting a lot of their communities. And while we're going out to these communities, we're like, do you know any groups who you think would want to talk to us about housing or the next regional development guide, who have an appetite for kind of talking about higher level policy planning, and would be like happy to be engaged for an hour or two. So we're trying to cast the net broad. The other thing that we have, that we're fortunate to have to draw on, is we have community engagement staff that have worked at the council for more than 10 years at this point. So she's seen more than one cycle of this, and more than one cycle of the Regional Development Guide, and is following up with some of the groups that we talked to last time. So when we're reaching out to these groups, we're kind of we're offering like, well, we could talk about housing, but if you're more interested in a different topic area, let us know, and we'll kind of link you up with whoever at the council could talk to you about transportation or parks, or more specifically land use is what ends up coming up for us.
And how about, Mr. Chair, how about social workers, particularly those that work with counties? Is there a connection with those professionals?
That's a great suggestion. Yeah. One of my questions for you at the end is, who else should we talk to?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking both social workers, and I know this may alarm some folks, but I even think to some extent law enforcement officials see a lot, and they may be able to give some housing insights that could be very constructive in terms of knowing where needs are.
Thank you, Councilmember. I would add the faith community.
Oh,
I think that's an
absolutely.
under-leveraged resource in this conversation.
Absolutely.
Cool. Further discussion at this point?
Well,
Yep.
and even medical facilities. All of those would be good resources.
Thank you.
And Ms. Lovelace, please.
And one other, I think this is my last area of main content that I wanted to share with you, is a quick and brief and made to fit on one page table of contents for the housing policy plan. And so this is to give you an idea of where our focus is, and more than an idea of how we plan to organize things in the final document. One that we think is important to focus on is the clarity in roles, kind of pointing back to the earlier slide where we showed the different levels of government and the roles that each level of government played in housing policy. We are still today dealing with kind of like word of mouth and misunderstanding about what the council's role is. And we think that making that clear only makes our job easier and makes the jobs of others easier to know where to fill in. So that's a big one. Also kind of naming what our roles are very clearly. One thing that I really like about our current housing policy plan is that every time it discusses a different issue in housing, it names exactly what the council role is to describe that. And so I think not only making a clear summary of what our role is in housing as the council in the document, but continuing that kind of detailed note of what our role is really important. Then comes kind of pressing regional housing needs, starting with kind of a regional need gap analysis. So this is where we'll focus on all of the special populations within our region that have housing needs that kind of fall outside of the norm and the way that government is kind of set up to help people who have housing problems. This includes populations that are interested in low or no interest financing to purchase a house, youth and specific issues that they have, our unhoused neighbors, folks with disabilities, folks who are aging, all of our different groups, kind of shining a special light on needs that we have within our region and hoping not to miss any. There's also, I'm hoping to talk a little bit about affordability definitions, the work that we're hoping to roll out later this week. And then focus on our affordable housing need allocation, where we assign a number to each community of affordable housing that we think that they will need to build in order to meet the need for just the growth in the next decade. There has been, for many decades, a connection between the need and connection to low-wage jobs within the region, and we plan to continue that within this next version of the affordable housing need. There's also, as we've had discussions internally, a word that we've kind of all started to coalesce around is dignity in housing. That comes in the form of both housing stability and choice. So both for owners and renters, regardless of tenure, offering people dignity within housing. That could look like a lot of different things, and we're hoping to kind of learn more as we talk to folks in community exchange sessions and see what comes up. Regional choice, which is reflected through our land guided for affordable housing policy, the statute that we read earlier that requires that each community guide enough land such that they could possibly meet their need. And then last but not least, priorities across our programs and operations that we control within house. Councilmember Chambliss, to your earlier point about kind of being ready for if we don't have the funds to kind of follow through with things. One of the things I'm most excited about as part of our scenario planning work that you might have heard in other areas so far is that we're looking at how to make our work resilient, both for economic booms and economic recessions. And so I'm really glad you brought that point up because it's something that we've been spending a lot of time working on. So just to give you an idea of kind of where we're headed in the next couple of months, in May, so this month we're starting everything. First survey is coming out, first community exchange session tomorrow morning. Through the summer, hoping to get a lot of community exchange sessions. We're shooting for 10 and hoping we grab more than that. And then between September and October, kind of transitioning from community exchange sessions into more focused work group, finishing up the work group hopefully by the end of this calendar year, and then writing in 2024. So my questions for you are, we've already talked a little bit about who do you know that I haven't mentioned that should be involved, especially if you know rural groups that kind of have an appetite for this. I should have mentioned earlier that one group we're hoping to reach out to is the group that we gave a grant to at the Corcoran Manufactured Home Park many years ago. And they have a homework help organization that's very active there. Then is there anything obvious missing from the table of contents that you hear about regularly with your constituents that we should be sure to include? And what do you want to talk most about next time I come to present to this committee? Thank you.
Councilmember Chambliss and then Councilmember Vento.
Thank you. Going back to the slide on page 10, when we were talking about the pressing regional housing needs, the affordable housing need allocation in connection to low-wage jobs. Can you talk to me about the connection to the low-wage jobs? The first thing that popped in my mind was connection to good-paying jobs. So I was kind of thrown off a little bit there.
Yeah. So when we calculate the affordable housing need allocation, we're looking at the growth for the next decade. So how many more households are we going to have in the region for the next decade? And of those households, how many do we think are going to make low incomes? How many households do we think are going to make 80% AMI and below? And within that, when we're kind of like, we could just say, okay, that's it, and each community gets their fair share of that portion based on their population growth. But we go beyond that, and we look at which communities have a center of low-wage jobs that does not match their housing opportunities for low-wage people. And so if there's a mismatch, that community gets a slightly higher concentration. The inverse is also true, where a community has some low-wage jobs, but they have an amazing amount of homes for people with low-wage jobs to live, and they would get a slightly lower allocation as compared to other communities. So there are historically, that's been an adjustment factor that we've always kind of used, and we hope to keep that one kind of in place.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and one more comment, and that's really great because that's dealing with the reality. So I like that. You know, we have a digital world now that's gone even more digital since the pandemic, and we can talk to people all across the country, and going to some conferences in the United States or listening to panel discussions with other housing experts. Are we doing that in terms of policymakers? Is there an opportunity for us to identify some best practices that are working for similar ecosystems or environments?
Chair, Councilmember Chambliss, I think I'm missing the point of your question.
So-
Can you say just a little bit more?
Yeah, in terms of our roles in working with other policymakers, are we going beyond just our region? Because there may be other regions that have a similar ecosystems or similar issues that they have resolved, and I'm wondering if we might be able to glean some best practices from them.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. Thank you, Chair, Councilmember Chambliss. Just organically, in the past, like over the pandemic, a lot of folks from other regions have contacted us because they see our housing policy plan and decades-long commitment to fair housing across our region. And they want to pick our brain on, like, how do you allocate this need to every city? Do they do it? Like, how do So because of that, I mean, I've been very lucky to learn a little bit about different metropolitan areas across the nation's ideas on what that partnership should look like and what the role of like a regional governing authority should look like as opposed to local authorities. In some cases, local authorities are asking for that type of collaboration. That's true in the Seattle region, and it's also true in the Washington, D.C. region. They're kind of working to catch up with us. It's also true in Kansas City. They called us and asked us, like, all of our cities are asking us to figure out what a fair share looks like. Tell us more about your calculation and how you've done that. So everyone is trying to figure this out at the same time, and everyone is kind of a unique snowflake. I wish there was a clear answer from all of that, but really it just tells the story of kind of different histories across the nation, and so it's been really fun to have those conversations, but I wouldn't say that there's really a best practice yet. It's an emerging area of policy. So we're hoping to figure it out.
Thank you.
Yeah, Director Bras.
I would add too, kind of related to a lot of what we've talked about at this committee, the whole as well, around how housing needs might change because of work from home and telework. We're all kind of in the same, I don't know, what do you think, kind of boat, and figuring that out. And some communities have really, are on the far one end of the spectrum where they're the receivers of a whole lot of teleworkers, talking about, your Montana, beautiful mountain skylines where you can work anywhere. But there's a lot of our peers who are like us, where people are still hanging around, but maybe they're not coming into the office, 5 days a week, and trying to figure out, well, what does that mean for what people want in their local housing stock now? They might still be here, but just their needs have changed without having had any sort of other life change in any way, like their kids didn't move out, maybe they moved back in, or maybe, they didn't get married or anything, but now their job is different, so they're wanting to be at home differently. So those are all things where, kind of in this group, across the nation where everyone's trying to figure that out at the same time of what does that look like? So all learning from one another.
Councilmember Chambliss?
Thank you for sharing that, because I was just listening to probably NPR radio, and they were talking about how there are individuals working remotely in places that are very beautiful and have a lot of views, and how that's driving up the housing costs in those areas.
Yep.
So it is very interesting to see that and what's going to happen. But also the reverse could also happen, where maybe there are opportunities to work in areas where the housing costs are lower, and you can still, manage your bills. So.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Bento, then Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add to the groups that you might want to consider including in the engagement, AARP, Minnesota, and the cities within Minnesota that have already been designated or are in the planning process to become designated as age-friendly communities and counties. There are a number of them here in the metro region, and I think it would be great to include them. Housing frequently comes up in those conversations. And the other policy area, I don't know that I'm excited about it, but I think it's something we need to think about, and that is the impact of housing policy decisions on the environment, and actually the issue of water. Northeastern metro area right now is in the middle of a bit of a water crisis, and I can't even tell you right off the top of my head what the current status is of legislation that they're looking at, but meanwhile they're under a court order and dealing with a lot of politics around water. So my question is, not just in terms of water, but including water, what impact do the housing policy decisions we make have on the environment and climate change? And how do we make those decisions and plan responsibly?
Chair, Councilmember Vento, I think you're really going to enjoy scenario planning discussions later on.
I love scenario planning.
You do, you were talking about it earlier, Councilmember Bento. Further discussion, Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Hilary, you mentioned the CAP agencies earlier, and it just reminded me, so earlier this winter, Ramsey County Commissioner Nicole Frethem recruited me to get on the CAP agency of Ramsey and Washington County. So if there are any staff connections that I could help facilitate in any way, just let me know.
Thank you. Cool.
You, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple of things. From slide 10, when you were talking about the land guided for affordable housing, my observation has been that many times when cities upzone land for high density, all it does is drive up the price of the land, so it doesn't end up being, you know, well suited for affordable housing because it costs a lot. And a lot of the opportunities that actually happen are dead strip malls or land that's been basically zoned for the wrong thing and sits there for a long time with nobody doing anything to it, rather than the land that has been zoned for high-density housing from the get-go. It seems more and more like there's less connection between zoning and where the housing actually goes and gets built for multifamily, particularly affordable multifamily projects. The other thing that occurred to me was that since we're talking about the components for the housing need, that transit access is a key piece of that, which got removed in the last housing policy plan discussion. And I was actually watching the meeting as they were arguing amongst themselves, and it was kind of a close vote, but it went in favor of not having the transportation access be a factor. But particularly for below 30% of median income, not having access to transit and metro mobility is a key factor in whether people can survive. Especially having the good metro mobility where it's the federally mandated kind rather than the metro mobility that's state mandated where they can say no if they don't have enough vehicles. So I think looking at putting that back into the calculation for need, I think it would be a step in the right direction. Also, many cities have been doing market studies to figure out what they could actually build in the future based on what money is there and land that's there and interest and whatnot. And we should look at how our projections match up with those market studies that communities are doing. I know Scott County does one frequently for the whole county. Lakeville just did one for Lakeville, and they don't have the complete data all sorted through yet, but they're in the process. But looking at what's actually possible is important.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, I also would be very interested in seeing if we can include, you know, the transportation access in the housing policy, because, you know, historically, I know that that has been a problem. If people need to get to jobs or to healthcare or services, that's really important, and I think that was also part of our regional choice considerations. So maybe revisiting that and tying our regional choice to transportation as it's needed.
Thank you, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing that I forgot to say about that, this is what, my fourth time around the hamster wheel on regional planning at different levels of the process, but now I lost my train of thought again because I got off on a different tangent. We used to look at the region as, you know, at some point the suburbs that don't have transit will get transit because the system keeps expanding. Things have changed in the last 10 years, and we're not looking at expanding transit to everywhere. So I think we need to recognize that in some of our projections on where people are going to go, because it's not a matter of when transit will get to those communities. Some of them just are never going to have it other than dial-a-ride service, and we need to accept that as our reality.
Thank you.
Yeah, Chair,
Councilmember Chambliss.
worth further discussion, I for sure. To say that, you know, they may never get it, that kind of sits hard.
It's the truth.
But I mean, maybe looking at how we're filling out transportation throughout the region, and I've mentioned this before, that there are some areas that are getting more mature in the transportation access. I mean, they have regular buses, they have the ABRT buses, they have the Metro Mobility, and they have, what do we call that? In North Minneapolis, we have
Microtransit?
microtransit, yeah. So at some point, maybe the shift needs to move to the areas that don't have as much access. And that would be some of the suburban areas, I would think.
Yeah, I think this, if I may, this is a really interesting conversation. I was already jotting notes down, and now you two, you council members have led kind of in what I was considering, and you could see is this a gap? Is that what we're talking about? Is this part of a gap analysis? Or if you go straight up, who has access to transit or when it's planned and connect that to the affordable housing allocation, you could see suddenly some communities aren't going to have any affordable housing allocation if they're not meeting this transit sort of threshold. And I'll recognize you in just a second, Councilmember Wolf. And so I'm not really sure where this falls in our sort of metrics, but I think it's interesting and a necessary part of the conversation. And this is what I was going to say after everyone else had talked, but I'll just say it right now to answer your questions, Hilary. And the one, I love in the table of contents that the word dignity is appearing here. And it just seems like in the policy realm, there's so many, it's kind of a gap of policy where the impact on people and on their actual day-to-day lives maybe doesn't really come through. And I'm really interested to see how naming that in the table of contents what impact that has on the work product that comes forward in the potential policies. And so part of it, I'd say dignity of work, dignity of being able to access a job, there are other parts than just having a nice place to live. And I feel like this conversation about transportation is sort of may sort of fit into that heading. And so that was one of the things I was going to say at the end. I'm really chatty for a chair tonight. I usually don't talk this much.
You've missed us.
What's that? I missed it. It's been 2 cycles. Yeah, it's all pent up. Okay, thank you, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not saying that there would be no requirement for those communities. I'm saying that it's a smaller group of people that they can accommodate the needs of at the very low income levels. And it may be an opportunity to have more 50% or 80%, recognizing the local needs and limitations. In my district, most of my district does not have transit other than dial-a-ride. And like Farmington has tried many times to get transit. They wanted to have at least a parking ride or something. And within our transportation division, they're saying it's not going to happen. There's just bigger needs other parts of the region, and it's never going to happen. So just getting out of our silos and recognizing what planning is going on in other parts of the council, I think, is an important part of the housing discussion.
Thank you, Councilmember Wolf, and agree. And I was just sort of speaking in broad strokes or something, but you could see it would have some impact on on affordable housing allocations. And is it the impact that we want it to have? Or is it that there are other related issues that should be considered as we're looking at putting together the housing policy plan? It's dynamic, right? And Director Barajas wants to weigh in.
If I just wanted to add, while we're talking in the context of housing here, some of the conversation that you've been having is around where we allocate growth overall. And our forecasting staff that's been here in front of you before works with a team of forecasters across our divisions, including our transportation forecasters and modelers too, who are trying to figure out where is it all going to go and how does it all fit together. So it is part of one of those model inputs in the overall forecasting of where those local allocations go, but certainly we can continue to have the conversation and key that up for our housing policy work as well. Because that housing policy allocation builds off of the forecast, so that's where we kind of build those down into increasingly more detailed levels of data, and you as policymakers get to weigh the pros and cons of those factors and what those outcomes are. But we certainly can bring that in front of you.
Thank you. Further discussion? Further responses for Hilary. So I said most of what I wanted to say earlier, but to your questions that you're asking us, I think I hit the second two questions, but also the groups or specific people that should be involved, and I think, you understand what's going on, but I just made the quick comment about the faith community, and, there's the big, well-known coalitions of faith interests that advocate for housing policy, and that wasn't who I meant so much, but I'm guessing as you go through the metro and in some of the smaller communities and using the relationships that you have, there just seems to be these specific churches, let's say, that is really interested in housing and they're actually doing something about it, sort of on their own, and so it's sort of capturing those very, very hyper-local thought leaders in these maybe smaller communities. Yeah, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with you on that, and there are some churches that have larger properties than they need for just their church that have been adding on, building senior housing and affordable housing and other sorts of things right on their church campus. So that's a good group to talk to. And also developers. I mean, they're the ones that actually have to make the things happen on the ground. So conferring with them on what works and what doesn't is important.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Bento.
I thought I was done, but I wasn't. The other issue as it relates to policy is doing what we can to help share the housing burden. I am really concerned about the just never ceasing pressure on Minneapolis and St. Paul. And it's particularly hitting for, I think, for St. Paul, with particularly as it relates to the homeless population. And you cited it very well, Councilmember Chambliss, with downtown Minneapolis. And I got a little nervous at a transportation committee meeting last week because there's talk about what to do with part of the property near the central station and how to develop that property. And there was a reference to housing, and my first thought was, oh my God, no. Yeah, we need housing, but we don't need it right there. And the question was, would it be affordable? Would it be market rate? And that wasn't their discussion to have, but they were talking about that particular piece of property. And I worry about these empty buildings in downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul and what's going to happen to them. And one of my fears is that they're all going to become housing, and we're going to continue to pile on and pile on and pile on in the core cities. And I don't know how much more of that we can do. And the more it's done, the less need there is for the rest of the region to step up and do their part. So I don't know what I'm trying to say other than that. I think we've got to draw together the business leaders and as well as all of the other groups that we've talked about. Maybe MSP, greater MSP needs to be a part of this conversation. But how do we get really just kind of visionary about this post-COVID era we're in? I'm over dramatizing this perhaps to some extent, but it's scary.
Thank you, Councilmember. Anything else? Otherwise, Hilary, do you have anything for us to wrap it up?
I really appreciate all of the conversation. And if you think of any more groups that I should talk to or you have specific contacts, feel free to email me. I just want to encourage you to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the work. Yeah, committee members, thanks. Thank you very much, Jamie, for filling in and for supporting us here. And it's too bad the new council members aren't here because I think we had some really rich discussion.
I could send them the live video stream.
Please, I would appreciate that.
I wrote it right down and I will get that to their council email.
Thank you.
Tomorrow morning.
Director Brown has anything for us before we adjourn?
Yeah, just a reminder, on Wednesday, we'll have our youth leader can't talk anymore, collaboration. We'll have an expo starting at 3:30. Right out here in this first floor somewhere, so you can engage with them not on camera and get to know the work that our youth have been doing. They're working really hard up to the deadline. They're feeling a little nervous, so I really appreciate the welcoming place that you'll set for that.
And will we be in here or?
And we'll be in here.
Okay,
Yep.
we will be in.
We have a large group joining you.
Okay, good.
Thanks for that notice. It's always enjoyable, for sure, when you present. Cool. Anything else? Seeing no further business before this committee, we're adjourned.